This video is a slideshow presentation of images obtained through internet search. I have no rights to the images. All audio and text is copyrighted content. I, Louisa Koch, am the holder of that copyright. The images were edited by me to contain the book quotes, and I am providing the audio recording. From the Ashes by Louisa Koch, Chapter 1. Is there any sound more odious than the beeping of an alarm clock? Well, this morning in particular, it was the most horrible sound I'd ever heard. It was the sound that signaled that now was the time to start the day, the first day of my last year of high school, my own personal hell. It wasn't that I was unsuccessful in school. I'd always had pretty good grades, and this year, like the year before, I was taking a few honors classes. Being invisible wasn't really my problem either. In fact, it would have welcomed that problem. I may never know what I did to make Kyla Pruitt fix her radar on me, but no matter what I did, good or bad, Kyla and her loyal followers would be sure to broadcast it. If called on by a teacher to answer a question, I was never safe. If I got the right answer, I was a know-it-all, a bookworm, a nerd, or my favorite, the teacher's pet. Because, teachers feed their favorite students the answers before calling on them. But if I got the wrong answer, she would say, "Well, I guess Miss Know-it-all really doesn't know everything," in her faux piteous voice. The real treat would be if I got the wrong answer and she would follow up with the right answer. Then she got to pull out the lovely phrase, "Oh my God, you don't know that." I lost many nights of sleep sophomore and junior years trying to figure out what I'd done to set her off, but came up with nothing. Maybe girls like her just pick a random target and stick with it until it stops being fun. So that was my goal for senior year, to make it not fun. My plan was to completely ignore her. Maybe if she couldn't see me upset, flustered, crying, or angry, she'd just give up. It was a long shot, but it was worth a try. In the past, my mom would take me and my little sister Charlotte to buy a new outfit for the first day of school. Though now that my sister was starting at the high school this year, she insisted on being called Charlie. Mom took Charlie to buy several new outfits for the start of the school year, but I decided not to go. Clothes seemed to be another easy target. I was either called a grungy mess, or I was trying too hard to fit in. A few months into the last school year, I found that simple jeans and a t-shirt finished the task that my face and body started, making me nearly invisible. I'd never been pretty like the cheerleaders, especially Kyla. As mean as she was to me, I couldn't deny that she was practically supermodel material. She had long, wavy golden hair down to her tiny waist. Her clothes, hair, and makeup were always perfect and right on the current style. If she didn't try so hard to make my life miserable, I would have probably idolized her. I, on the other hand, couldn't have been described best as average. My hair was a medium brown down to just below my shoulders, never caring much for clothes or wore whatever was comfortable. According to Kyla, I was a maybe cute in the right light grungy girl with muddy brown hair and secondhand clothes. At the same time, I was never to the point that anyone would call me ugly. Therefore, since I wasn't pretty enough to get glances from the boys, or ugly enough to get disgusting grimaces, I deemed myself forgettable on the attractiveness spectrum. Even if I'd been pretty to some boy, once Kyla had me on her radar, no boy would want to be linked to me. It'd be social suicide. Well, there was one boy linked to me, my friend Gary. In some ways, he had it worse than I did. He didn't have the continuous broadcasting of all his social failures to worry about like I did, but some of the football players would steal his lunch, knock his books out of his arms, or try to stuff him in his locker. He'd grown about 6 inches during junior year, so that last one was a lot harder to pull off ever since, but they still definitely had the power to intimidate him. Gary and I pairing up and becoming a couple would have totally made sense, because neither of us would have had any social sinking to worry about. Actually, we did try to go on a date once with the whole hand-holding, the door opening, and even the kiss goodnight. I really liked Gary, and he liked me, but being anything more than just friends felt too formal and just wrong. The kiss had been pretty nice, though. Besides, a little boy in kindergarten gave me a peck behind the playground. The kiss with Gary was my only real kiss. We decided, though, that it was better to stay friends. As friends, talking and joking around was so easy. Trying to date made everything uncomfortable and weird. We did make a pact that if neither of us had gotten married by the time we were 35, we would just deal with the uncomfortable and weird. Gary wasn't a bad-looking guy. He was almost as big as the guys who picked on him now, but after years of being smaller, he was too timid to fight back. He was well on his way to being tall, dark, and handsome, too. By that point, he was probably just south of 6 feet, with medium brown hair and eyes. If he wouldn't hunch over and walked around with more confidence, he'd be a real eye-catcher. I was pretty sure that after high school, when he'd meet girls who didn't know him as only a guy low in the social totem pole, he'd have no problem finding a girl, leaving me to fend for myself when I'd turned 35. He'd insisted that it'd be the same for me, that I'd go off to college where no one knew me as Claire, Miss Know-It-All Bookworm, who was always on Kyla's radar, and I'd get asked on plenty of dates. I'd usually just roll my eyes and give his shoulder a good shove when he talked about me finding a boyfriend in college, but inside I'd be crossing my fingers hoping that he was right. It wasn't that I needed someone to validate me or to take care of me. It was my parents. They had been married for over 20 years. They still held hands, made goo-goo eyes at each other, and I'd even catch them groping each other in the kitchen. It totally grossed me out, but at the same time, I knew that that's what I wanted someday. To have someone who, no matter how much time had passed, would love me and still find me beautiful. When I walked down to the kitchen to catch breakfast, I caught my dad kissing my mom's neck and let out a disgusting, "Ew, gross," which prompted my dad to spin my mom, dip her, and give her a big smooch on the lips. She responded by hitting me in the back of the neck with a wash rag in her hand, and the "Alan" rang out with the same pseudo-scolding tone I'd heard 1,000 times before. Simultaneously tickled, grossed out, and jealous, I sat down and poured a bowl of cereal. Charlie was finishing up breakfast and she planned to take the bus, and we need to leave almost 30 minutes before when I would usually leave for school. We only lived a few blocks away from the school, so I usually walked. But when Charlie said she wanted to take the bus, I didn't bother to ask her why. As a new student, of course she wanted to make her own place and her own friends before anyone besides her, me, and Gary knew that the same last name with me was more than just a coincidence. So when she picked up her backpack and made her way out the door, I said goodbye and good luck with nothing but sincerity. High school would be hard enough without Kyla deeming her guilty by association and placing her on her radar on her first day. I kept my distance all the way until graduation if that could help her to have an easier time of it. Even though Charlie was a little taller than me, there was something cute and petite about her. She had a slightly angular nose and prominent cheekbones. Someday she was probably going to be a heartbreaker. Charlie always was better in social situations than me too. Conversations always came so naturally to her. I, on the other hand, would be so distracted by the continuous war in my mind about whether my choice of words was too aloof, too needy, too personal, too reclusive, too anything, that nothing but social awkwardness would spill out through my words and body language. It was like I had Kyla's voice in the back of my mind, judging every word before it came out of my mouth. Between Charlie's social instincts, her confident body language, and her cute new clothes on her cute little body, she had a real chance if I just stayed out of the way. My mom and dad weren't completely on board with the idea. They didn't say anything, but I could tell by the looks they were exchanging with each other, which with Charlie and with me, that they were concerned that Charlie's behavior was selfish, that it meant that she was ashamed of me, and that it was upsetting me. I had hoped that by using a bright tone when I said goodbye to Charlie that it would have dispelled these fears. But they looked at me as if they were waiting for my voice to crack, my eyes to water. I wish that I could get it across to them that it didn't upset me. I cared about my sister enough that I'd never want my problems to affect her. I could understand that her behavior was just practical and not because she was ashamed of me. After Charlie left with her cute smile and wave, my mom and dad, failing to be subtle, kept looking at me. My dad peered over his newspaper and my mom over her coffee mug. I tried to pretend that I didn't notice and that my cereal bowl had my undivided attention. I could see the repeated changes in my mother's expression that suggested that she was repeatedly about to say something and then changing her mind. I couldn't really think of anything to say that'd put their minds at ease. Another 10 minutes of awkward silence passed before I decided to just head to school early. After rinsing my bowl and spoon and scooping up my backpack, I kissed my mom and dad each on the cheek like always, though in the past there had usually been conversation first, and headed towards the door. "Have a good day, dear," my mom called unconvincingly. "I'll try." I turned the doorknob and pushed the back door open a couple inches when I finally thought of something to say. With my hand still on the doorknob, I turned back and said as nonchalantly as I could, "Don't worry, I'll keep an eye on Charlie, even while I'm keeping my distance." Before they could respond, I turned and trotted down the stairs toward the sidewalk that would take me to school. I'd walked this way hundreds of times before, but there was something different about today. Almost like there was a hope somewhere deep inside that I was trying desperately to ignore. But quickly my mind returned to the breakfast table and the few words spoken there. I deeply hoped that my parting words to my parents would get them to stop worrying about me. I knew that it was me and my feelings that they were concerned about, but maybe if I could convince them that my concerns were for Charlie, and that I'd assumed that theirs were also, they could finally accept that Charlie wasn't hurting my feelings after all. I slowly trudged my way up the hill towards school. Though desperate to escape the awkward silence and stares at home, I was in no hurry to get there. I felt more like a fugitive taking the walk to the police station to turn myself in than a senior on her way to start her last year of high school. But even though I was filled with dread about what Kyla was sure to have in store for me this year, the impossible to ignore hope rose again. Something inside of me was insisting that this year was going to be different, but I refused to trust it. Just because we were seniors now didn't mean that Kyla would suddenly leave me alone. I wasn't going to resign myself to this hope just to set myself up for further disappointment. As slowly as I was walking, it seemed to only be seconds later that I was crossing the busy road that separated my neighborhood from the high school. I made my way up the sidewalk outside the fence surrounding the track and football field. There were a few adults from the area taking their morning run on the track. School buses passed me and started unloading in front of the school. Everyone seemed happy to be there, except me. I struggled to fight the urge to turn around and run back home, but pretty soon I was walking up the stairs and through the doors. The halls were filled with people smiling, hugging, greeting each other, and catching up with friends they hadn't seen over the summer. I never understood why people looked so happy on the first day of school. There were so many people who genuinely seemed to love high school. But then again, most of these people were popular, so what was there not to like for them? I'm sure I would have liked high school if I was popular, part of a team, or if I was just left alone. After setting up my locker and packing my backpack for the morning classes, I walked over to Gary's locker to see if he had gotten to school yet. Sure enough, there he was, putting the last of his notebooks for the morning in his backpack. "Ready for this?" I asked in the cheeriest voice I could muster as I leaned around the door of his locker. "Don't you know it?" he replied in a tone dripping with sarcasm. "God, at least it's our last first day back in this hellhole." "Amen to that. What do you have today?" We pulled out our schedules and compared them. We had calculus together, second period, and lunch together. But neither of our afternoon classes were together. Our second day we had Spanish and computer lab together, but different lunch times and afternoon classes. Well, at least we have a couple of classes together. I wonder how many classes I have with Kyla. Hopefully none. I already know I have gym with Travis Miller and his gang. I overheard them talking when I walked by. The locker room before and after class is going to be so much fun. Oh no, Gary, just stay away from them, okay? I'll try, but they always seem to find me. I knew what he meant. try as I might, I couldn't seem to escape Kyla's notice. No matter how invisible I would try to be, she could always find me. The first part of freshman year, I had a huge crush on Travis Miller. I only had one class with him, but I would stare at him the whole time. He had wavy blonde hair, green eyes, and broad shoulders. Then, second semester, I met Gary. We had biology together and we were lab partners. It was around that time that I started having problems with Kyla and Gary started having problems with Travis. It didn't take long before Gary and I were best friends and I was completely over my crush on Travis. He was still probably as good looking as before, but the combination of his arrogance about his appearance and the way he treated Gary made me sick to look at him. Actually, I was a little surprised that Travis and Kyla never ended up dating. I mean, every couple of months, Kyla would get bored and change everything up. She did a completely new look, new clothes, new hairstyle, and new arm candy. Of course, she could afford to do that. I heard a rumor once that her parents were doctors or lawyers or something and worked crazy hours, so they made up for their absence by getting her new stuff all the time. Even with the ever-revolving door of boy toys, she never once dated Travis. At least, never officially. The first bell rang as Gary pushed his locker close. "See you in a bit," he said before turning and walking away from me. I smiled and waved and then turned to make my way to class. I'd hoped that we would have had our first class together. I could have used the moral support. At least it'd only be an hour and a half until we'd have class together. It was nice to know I'd at least have one friendly face in my next class. As I entered the room for American Lit, I let my eyes scan the room. I recognized every face that I saw, though some of the names escaped me. Of course, Kyla was there, and a large portion of her loyal followers were with her. It wasn't until my eyes reached the middle of the back row that I saw someone that I was pretty sure I'd never seen before. His head was turned down toward his desk, so it was hard to be sure, but I didn't recognize him. Even though he was sitting and slouching, I could tell he was pretty tall, probably 6 feet if not a bit taller. His short, dark hair was effortlessly tousled. I could see evidence of lean, toned muscles in his arms and chest beneath his fitted t-shirt. Just what the school needed, another gorgeous jock that could get any girl he wanted, even if he was a complete jerk who treated the guys that didn't join the team like they were worthless. I wasn't surprised to see that most of the girls in the room were looking his way, including Kyla. Of course, my first class of the year would be with Kyla, and with this new guy in the class who was obviously good-looking, she'd waste no time laying into me to both catch his attention and to mark me unworthy of his notice. It was going to be one long semester for sure. There was almost no seats left, leaving me no choice but to sit 2 seats directly in front of Kyla, who was, of course, had set herself right next to the new guy. I rolled my eyes in anticipation of the attempt she was sure to make at starting a conversation with him, dropping a pencil on the floor next to him, asking for help with something, or if all else fails, giggling at everything he said. Again, this is going to be a long semester. The second bell rang as the last few students took their seats. When Miss Langley called roll and the new guy said "here" to the name Luke Davis, I was absolutely sure that I didn't know him. Kyla found a way to say "here" in a giggly-sounding sing-song voice, which surely drew the attention of half the boys in the room. And if my presence in the room had passed her notice before, Kyla definitely knew I was there when Miss Langley called out "Claire Shepherd" loud and clear. I called out "here" in the most confident tone I could manage, but I knew the game had begun. Now I really wished Gary would have been there for moral support. At least I'd have him in my next class to vent about all that could and probably would go wrong in this class. The first half of the class was spent going over the syllabus. During the 5-minute break halfway between class, I kept my head down and copied the syllabus into my planner. Throughout the classroom, I could hear people sharing summer vacation stories. If I strained, I could catch a few words of Kyla's attempt to catch Luke's attention. Her attempts to start a conversation must have been failing because after pausing a few seconds, she would ask another question. I risked a look behind to see her leaning toward him as far as she could with a big, girlish grin on her face. Luke, on the other hand, was still staring down at his desk with a nondescript expression. He must have been mm-hmming and mm-hmming because once in a while, Kyla would ring out with an, "Oh, cool," making it sound like they were deep in conversation, when by the look on his face, he was just hoping she'd shut up. That gave me some guilty satisfaction. Before Kyla had succeeded in drawing Luke into any real conversation, Miss Langley was calling the class back to order. I couldn't help but smile a little at her failure, even though I knew it'd probably end up being taken out on me. And soon she'd get her opportunity. The rest of the class was to be spent with each student briefly introducing themselves, talking about what they liked to read for fun, and if there was an author or book that had spoken to them personally in the past. She had us stand up and introduce ourselves alphabetically, leaving me almost last. I couldn't help but roll my eyes when it was Kyla's turn. Of course, she picked Maya Angelou and painted herself out to be quite the philanthropist. Her glances toward Luke while she spoke were, shall I say, less than subtle. All too soon it was my turn. I'd never been comfortable with having eyes on me, and that day was no exception. My thoughts were torn, as they always were when Kyla was around. Do I say what I really think? What would give her the least to comment on? After a moment's delay, I started my introduction with my eyes to the floor. Hi, I'm Claire Shepard. I like to read a lot of different types of books, but my favorite would have to be mysteries, thrillers, fantasies, and dystopian society books. One of my all-time favorites is The Princess Bride. It's interesting to me that the author was able to poke fun at romance, fantasy, and adventure novels, while at the same time writing a story full of romance, fantasy, and adventure. Without looking up, I sat back down at my desk. I could still feel the eyes on me, and that my face was turning red. For a second, I thought I'd been able to speak in class without comment, but no such luck. "Oh my God, that is so deep," Kyla chimed in with her falsely enthusiastic Valley Girl voice. A few quiet snickers broke out throughout the classroom, most likely from some of Kyla's chums. Miss Langley cleared her throat loudly, then called on the next student. One of the most frustrating things about Kyla's running commentary was the teacher's tolerance of it. If even one teacher had called her out on it, my entire high school experience may have been different. But I'll never know, because none of them ever did. When the introductions were over, there were still 20 minutes left before the bell would ring. Miss Langley decided to ask us if we'd read any good books over the summer. When no one volunteered, she started calling on people. After 15 minutes, my heart dropped into my stomach. Miss Langley's eyes had met mine. Even before she opened her mouth, my heart was racing. As if in slow motion, she opened her mouth and said, "Claire, did you read anything interesting this summer?" I stumbled over my words as I told her about the popular young adult trilogy I'd just finished. I described to her the heroine who had gone from a loner to a hero in her society. "Well, books aren't like real life," Kyla interjected. Again, the muffled snickers erupted. "Why don't you just lay off?" I heard an unfamiliar voice growl through clenched teeth. I couldn't help myself. I turned towards the voice and was shocked to see Luke staring daggers at Kyla. My jaw dropped to the floor. No one had ever spoken up for me before, and he was brave enough to do it on his first day in a new school. I turned back towards the front, turning my face down towards my desk, and allowed myself a small smile. The entire classroom was silent. Even Miss Langley stared at him in silent surprise. Before anyone had spoken, the bell rang, and everyone except Luke and me had jumped up and left the room as quickly as they could, including Kyla, who had left red-faced. I picked up my backpack and turned to see Luke still putting things into his backpack. I took 2 steps towards the door before turning and walking towards Luke. I stopped, still a few feet from the front of his desk. Keeping my eyes on his worn dark blue sneakers, I told him, "That was the first time anyone has ever spoken up for me. So, thank you. I really appreciate it." "Yeah, fine, whatever." He scooped up his backpack, sidled past me, and rushed out the door. I choked back the tears forming in my eyes. I was wrong. He hadn't been defending me. He'd just been annoyed with Kyla. It'd been a long time since Kyla had made me cry, because her comments were no longer surprising. But his dismissal of my thank you took me off guard. A few minutes later, I was entering the classroom for calculus with no memory of walking there. I saw Gary sitting in the middle of the room, and that he had saved a seat to his left for me. I must have had a telling expression on my face because he immediately asked me what was wrong. I don't want to talk about it right now, later, okay? Gary nodded, but the look of concern stayed firmly in place. Calculus went by quickly with Gary in class and no Kyla. As expected, we went over the syllabus after roll call, did brief introductions for the sake of the teacher, and had enough time for a brief lecture on the first unit, which was mostly just review anyway. After the bell rang, Gary and I agreed to change out our morning books for our afternoon books and to meet in the cafeteria. I didn't know what to tell him. Kyla's words had been expected and barely even registered. I hadn't really told him any of the specifics about things that Kyla had said in almost a year. And what could I tell him about Luke? I wasn't even sure if it was fair for me to be upset about how he'd responded to me when I thanked him. Even if he hadn't really spoken up for my sake, it was still more than anyone had done for me before. And I thanked him. Was his acceptance of the thank you really that important? Not telling Gary anything wasn't an option. He'd seen that I was upset already, so I couldn't just blow it off. But what to tell him? I changed up my books at the locker, then started toward the cafeteria half in a daze. Oblivious to everything around me, I almost walked right into someone. When I looked up, I realized it was Luke. His hands were gripping my arms. Almost before I'd even noticed, his hands dropped to his sides. Oh, I'm sorry. I guess I wasn't paying any attention. No, it's fine, he interrupted. Look, I'm sorry for the way that I acted before. I was still really mad and wasn't thinking. So again, I'm sorry, and you're welcome. He wouldn't look me in the eye when he spoke. His eyes were looking somewhere on or near my face, but were turned just enough to avoid eye contact. The corner of his mouth pulled up into a quick, small, nervous grin. Before I could respond, he'd turned and walked away towards the cafeteria. I just stood there for a moment, stunned. If I was unsure of what to tell Gary before, now I had absolutely no idea. Still at a complete loss for words, I started towards the cafeteria again to meet Gary. End of chapter 1.